Oleg Lisnyi, the president of the analytical center Politica, is now ready to join our broadcast. Oleg, good morning. We're happy to welcome you live on Freedom TV channel.
Hello.
Good morning. Hello.
Oleg, well, really, we're all watching as Ukraine's long range sanctions are intensifying, targeting strategic objectives, even deep in the rear, on the territory of the aggressor country. We're seeing how the support from our Western partners is growing. Of course. We would like the delivery of military aid packages to happen more clearly, more actively. But nevertheless, overall, really, the pressure does need to be increased. Both President Volodymyr Zelensky and Acting Foreign Minister Sabiga have spoken about this more than once. And our partners, well, at least it seems that way, understand the need for this maximum strengthening. It even seems, according to various detailed reports from several Russian media outlets, that the immense pressure there is already quite noticeable and is now significantly affecting the overall state of the entire Russian economy in a very profound way. What do you think really needs to happen for this pressure to become extremely painful so that the Kremlin, if not to stop the war immediately, then at least seriously considers that it's necessary to do so and that it's time to sit down at the negotiating table?
Well, the most important thing happening right now, and we are witnessing it, and our army is directly carrying it out, is the large scale transfer of the war onto the enemy's territory. Because at the beginning of the war, Russia felt quite comfortable, both the average Russian and the so called deep people, because it was happening somewhere else, mostly on TV, somewhere in the news. But their homes weren't burning, salaries were being paid, people were alive and well, relaxing, having fun, and let's say talking about what should be done abroad, outside the Russian Federation. Now that's no longer the case. What needs to be done? And that's exactly what's being done. In fact, what we're seeing now is another way of putting pressure on the Russian Federation, pressure on specific sensitive spots. One of these, which has already become routine for Russians, just like it has for us, is that oil refineries and other enterprises in that sector, which are tied to the idea that Russia's just a big gas station, are regularly catching fire. Now, places like Wildberries have been targeted as well, right? This is something that disrupts logistics, both military and otherwise, because these facilities, these warehouses, stored or transferred goods that could be used not only in civilian life, but also for producing things like drones. SPDs, fiber optics, it's not something we made up, it's what the Russians themselves are showing. Next, it should be data centers, which are supposed to take down, so to speak, the online life of the Russian Federation. That's why I think that, well, transportation logistics, this is already an axiom, is collapsing not only in the temporarily occupied territories, but also on Russian territory closer to the border with Ukraine. So the direction is correct, and the main thing is that it should be systematic and go deeper, sorry for the tautology, deeper into the territory so that all of Russia understands that the war is going on, especially now. Medium and small business owners, they really felt the war when their goods burned, when they had nothing to sell, but still had to pay back the money. No one has canceled the loans. That's why the war on the territory of the Russian Federation needs to intensify even more. Then, maybe, something will awaken in the common people, although I really doubt it. And I still count more on the elites wanting to stop this war, because it's not in their interest. I believe in that more.
Oleg, I'm also interested in your observations about how Russian propaganda is reacting to this, what kind of talking points the Kremlin's putting out. One of the latest things we often discuss on air is that there's suddenly a large number of honest Russians appearing, making all sorts of TikToks and Instagrams. And in one of these videos, I even saw an opinion where they said that people were forced to sign some documents, like everything was stolen, and they're trying to profit off poor Russians. What other versions have you seen of how the Kremlin, how Russian propaganda in general, tries to justify the fact that the war has actually come back to their own territory? And how do they work with this information? And it's also interesting how all of this is presented inside Russia.
For me, what's more important isn't that some bloggers have appeared, but the main blogger himself, Comrade Putin, who always hides from the press in critical situations and waits until it's all over. I think some of our viewers definitely remember how he reacted to the Kursk operation. I don't mean the territory of the Russian Federation, but the submarine, which he ignored for a very long time, and then just said, "What happened to it? It sank." I would really like him to say the same thing about the Russian Federation someday. Well, we'll live and see. So, what I'm saying is that bloggers are great. They each have their own target audience, but they don't cover everything. But then there's Comrade Putin, who, if I'm not mistaken, for the second time now has had to step into the spotlight and explain that, well, the economy, it's not all that bad. It's all temporary. Well, for now, he was a bit shy to mention, against the backdrop of the oil refining industry and gasoline, those same warehouses I mentioned earlier, because wild berries is actually quite a serious blow to the Russian Federation's economy. But he only mentioned it in passing. So, what they show there for different target audiences is one thing. But when the head of state, who always used to hide, is forced to go out among the people and say that everything is fine, I immediately remember an old Soviet joke. Back then, whenever they came out and said, well, we've got plenty of butter, industry's working great, and so on, about sugar or something else, it actually meant you needed to buy as much as possible, as quickly as possible, because things were really, really bad.
Yeah, that's true. In reality, things really are going very, very badly for them now. And the chairman of the State Duma, Volodin, even warned that literally any day now, things are going to change with fuel, which means there probably won't be any fuel at all. By the way, here's something interesting. So, the day before, there was a lot of talk and anticipation about the meeting between the gloomy minister and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And now, as a matter of fact, Rubio has already held that meeting with the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov, in the capital of the Philippines, Manila. And according to Rubio, one of the main topics of the talks was, of course, Russia's war against Ukraine. At the same time, Washington intends to help bring it to an end, Rubio once again emphasized. By the way, according to Russian media, the meeting lasted, attention, only 37 minutes. Oleg, what do you think? Considering the fact that just recently the gloomy minister Lavrov said that he expects to get an answer from Rubio about what Trump means when he talks about ending the war as soon as possible, the war that Moscow started against independent Ukraine. And here it was just 37 minutes and no statements at all. Neither side even tried to talk to the media. What do you think they talked about? There's just so little information, really.
I actually prefer that now Rubio is talking to the Russians himself, well, to the gloomy minister, and not to some emissaries who aren't professionals. This shows that, after all, I really hope that in the presidential administration, serious issues are now being handed over to responsible adults, to real professionals. That's very important. It means that Trump's trust and regard for Rubio is quite significant. The fact that they didn't come out to the press is pretty telling. If there's nothing to say, then there's no need to say anything. Therefore, I assumed that Lavrov eventually realized that the so called spirit of anchorage they came up with never existed, does not exist, and will never exist. Of course, in Russia, they're saying that the United States destroyed everything and now will take a tougher stance in negotiations regarding Ukraine, and we won't return any of the territories we supposedly promised in Anchorage. Well, that's just a lie. And, whenever Putin opens his mouth, even when he shouts hurrah, even that is a lie. He couldn't even manage to say that, right? So I'm satisfied with these negotiations because, unlike Lavrov, I didn't have any big expectations for him. So the situation is developing normally, we're doing our thing, and what we're doing appeals to Trump. Even at the World Cup, Trump goes to the winners, not to those who lost. So we're doing everything right. The main thing is to keep up the pace.
Yeah, that's true. Let's also discuss Ukraine's European partners. The new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Andy Burnham, and the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, discussed, among other things, the continued support for Ukraine during their first phone conversation. This was reported by the German government. Both leaders agreed to continue close cooperation between their countries and to promote the implementation of the Kensington Agreement. This agreement, which is a bilateral treaty of friendship, was signed in London on July 17th, 2025, by Merz and Burnham's predecessor, Keir Starmer. And here, I'd also like to hear your opinion on this. Basically, yes, there's nothing new here, but nevertheless, please comment. It's interesting. Why do you think Putin is trying to build a relationship with Trump, but, for example, not with Britain, Europe, or Germany? That's an interesting approach.
Well, first of all, the British Prime Minister himself said that he would support Ukraine even more than the previous Prime Minister did. And that makes sense because Britain sees Russia as an enemy. And it's clear that the communication happening with Germany will also happen with Zelensky and with Trump. Again, the British Prime Minister, the new British Prime Minister, promised to do this, but in a different order. He simply said that he would be with Ukraine and Zelensky, Trump. But that's not a big deal. The main thing is that for him, the Ukrainian issue is fundamental when it comes to confronting the current geopolitical situation. Why doesn't Putin want to talk to anyone except Trump? Well, first of all, it's because he thinks that right now he's on the same level as Trump. And that's actually thanks to Trump. Before that, he was like a pale, pale moth, sitting somewhere in a closet, peeking out to see who would call him, where he should go. And he mostly traveled around the post Soviet republics, well, sometimes to China or somewhere else. So Trump pulled him out of that political mothballs. And that's why Putin thinks there are elders in this world, and you have to talk to the elders. And as for everyone else, especially Europe, he doesn't care, because Trump also has a pretty uneven attitude toward Europe. So everything here is logical. He arranges everything in the spirit of his empire, right? There's a top person who decides everything, and that's who you need to talk to. But I think that's a mistaken perception of the world today.
Oleg, and now, if we have time, let's talk about something else. The Vatican is ready to host leaders for peace talks. President Zelensky announced this after meeting with the Holy See's delegation. What do you think? How realistic is such a platform? Actually, this idea has come up more than once already, but for a number of reasons, it hasn't been confirmed. What do you think about it this time?
If we're talking about a meeting of leaders, that's impossible because Putin is afraid to leave his own capital. He runs from bunker to bunker like a little rat and keeps calling Zelensky to come to him. But if we're talking about a lower level, then why not? The Vatican is basically neutral territory that would suit all sides. But again, we have to understand the logic of the Russian side, which is always tying things to specific dates and places. For example, they're fine with Turkey because they can link it to those so called Istanbul agreements or somewhere else that's convenient for them. And the Vatican, I think, is an uncomfortable place for them, partly because they simply don't want negotiations at this point. And that's a fact, because in particular, Putin thinks, I'll capture, God forbid, of course, and I really hope it doesn't happen, Donbass, and then I'll start talking. If that's the position of the Russian Federation, then no matter what you propose, they will reject everything.
Well, there's literally a minute and a half left until the moment of silence. In your opinion, which of Ukraine's partners will be the first to lose patience with Putin's unwillingness to negotiate? And when will we start talking about some kind of massive pressure?
It seems to me that our partners have plenty of patience because they're not the ones fighting and they operate with a different logic. They look at whether the current situation is beneficial for them or not. Let's at least look at how the 21st package of sanctions against the Russian Federation is being adopted. It's moving very slowly because economic factors are prevailing. I think everything will depend on what we do on the battlefield. The more successful we are, the easier it will be for our partners to get involved in the confrontation with the Russian Federation. I don't believe this will happen with actual soldiers, but I think they'll be able to provide concrete resources. So it's not even about patience here, but about what we can do to make it beneficial for them to end this as quickly as possible.